Hey everyone, welcome to our first episode of Accelerated Thinking. I'm joined here with Steve Farmer, part of the Accelerator team. Steve, we've got a really interesting topic we're going to cover today around authenticity, but before we kind of jump into it, would you mind just giving a bit of a brief introduction to yourself, and then we'll get going with some questions?
Yeah, hi Toby. Really looking forward to this conversation. Actually, a topic that's pretty interesting to my own heart. But been at Accelerator for 8 years, and learning and development for the last 25 years. Wow, that's crazy
Wow.
to put that into decades. But yeah, I became a leader of people at a very young age. Actually, in my early 20s, so I felt like I had to step into that role with authenticity, and I realised the value of showing my own vulnerabilities as an early years leader,
Yeah.
and then how that's made a path into life. So that's kind of like a very brief background into me as a leader.
Great. So loads of experience. I know we've been working with a client at the moment, and authenticity is probably the key topic that's come up throughout the kind of immersive learning that we've been doing. And, authenticity can mean different things to different people. So maybe my first question is, what does authenticity mean to you? And kind of how do you categorize authenticity in leadership?
I think it's about just being being intentional. Is a key word that comes to my mind around the self-awareness as a leader, but being prepared to show and be open with that transparency, because I think it's about trust. But in my past, I think about other leaders that I've really chosen to follow. That's probably gives me my point of reference and a framework to think around authenticity. So yeah, the transparency and the honesty and openness as a leader, and how that builds trust from a following perspective. And
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, that trust word is a really interesting one. I think you and I have both been fortunate that we've had strong leaders and managers in our past, and have taken the best bits of those people that we've been fortunate to work with. And,
yeah,
you think about what is core to those people. There is the credibility that they have. There is trust, and you feel like they approach different scenarios authentically. Now, authenticity is one of those words that tends to get, maybe misused, miscategorized. And you're a big believer in a Lumina practitioner. And I'd be really interested to understand, like, from a Lumina perspective, and when you're working with people from a leadership development perspective, how do you can't teach authenticity. It's about, I think, unlocking authenticity. So how do you think about that and the paradox with kind of authenticity from a Lumina perspective?
yeah. There's probably a few things in there. Yeah, one, from a Lumina perspective, I've been a practitioner of Lumina Spark for the last 5 years, and I think that's really helped me and raise my own personal level of self-awareness, because yeah, you've mentioned the word paradox, which is when we look at a couple of different qualities measured independently but against each other. But if I take that back just one step, though, the luminous spark allows you to understand your personality, and where difference might exist. So if I gave the example of my underlying persona, what I might be like naturally, and then measure that against some qualities that I know I've got to really dial into from a work perspective, there might be a gap. And that's, from a leadership perspective, is really enlightening and insightful, because I see that might be a dial up for me. So say if I chose a quality of tough, it's about having the ability to have a very candid, courageous conversation. And that might not be something that comes naturally to me, but I know that I've got to dial into that and tune into
Yeah.
that particular quality. But if I start to overdo that because I'm trying too hard, I could come across very inauthentic. So it's a that paradox of recognizing where my natural qualities might come through, or what I've got to work hard on.
Yeah, I think that's a great
Does that,
point, because
yeah.
because we all have those natural tendencies. And one thing I've done, Myers-Briggs and DISC, and one thing I love about Lumina is it shows you your natural self, your work self, and those overextended qualities when you're under pressure. And I think one thing I've learned from it and working with you is that how and when to dial into those things. So, that boils down to me to authenticity, knowing who you are and then how to apply that in a certain situation. I think is the key element. I mean, for me, like authenticity, when we're talking about it in a leadership perspective and when we're running our leadership development and talent development programs, we very much talk about authenticity as being that baseline of understanding. You mentioned about having courageous conversations, having difficult conversations, being able to lead teams, being able to lead through change. We're going through so much just general change in the world at the moment. When you're talking to aspiring leaders and leaders in that situation, how do you help them to dial into their authenticity? Because the point you just made is it's not a one size fits all thing, and people have to be very self-aware in order then to lead with authenticity. How do you kind of get through that challenge? Because it's very personal.
Yeah, it is very personal. If we take that change paradox as the operative word, when I know that when I experience change, and this is where I've worked with other leaders, and they often feel the same way, that you can be quite inspired by the opportunity of change, but actually then what it impacts upon you personally is also what you're thinking and feeling. And then if you're leading others, that ability to recognize that there's a bigger picture. So you're thinking about the more radical aspect of being driven by and inspired by a great change opportunity, but actually change opportunity then presents itself to team members and direct reports in a very different way. And then we start to go quite insular into more cautious approach. What is
Mm,
it going to mean for me? What's the impact upon me? So that ability as a leader to flex between those two paradox of helping and supporting team members through change, but recognizing that it could be very highly impactful for themselves. And
yeah.
that feels like to me, a great example of where I've helped other leaders, one, understand about their own personal experience, but also how they might use that ability to understand self, but be able to tune into understanding others, and then communicate that. So that's when
Mm,
again that authenticity piece comes in. So have I got the ability to put myself in their shoes and show that level of empathy? um, Even if I'm not experiencing that myself, can I appreciate that my team members may be? So then, open dialogue and transparency goes back to where trust occurs, rather than just expecting somebody to
yeah.
respond or behave as I might.
Yeah, 100%. I think as you become more, not necessarily senior, but as you start to work with teams and coach people and manage people, I think that intersection of understanding yourself, understanding others, behaving in an authentic way, but understanding the situation, because you put yourself, others, it's like a little Venn diagram in my mind, and then you put the situational context around it. Does that mean I need to be more assertive? Do I need to be less assertive? Do I need to be a bit more empathetic? Do I need to be a bit more directive? But staying true to who you are. And I think the point you just made there, I see this a lot working with senior executives, is they understand themselves. They understand the people and their teams, particularly if they're good leaders or they've been leading for a while, but being able to communicate it is a very different skill. And I think I'd be interested to get your view on what you think the link is between that authenticity and communicating and storytelling, because they're the people who have the biggest impact. That they can take people on a journey with them, in whether it's a change context, whether it's just being a leader.
Mm.
How would you approach that? How would you think about that? Or how would you coach someone that you're working with to communicate authentically?
I think the best thing I could do first probably is tell a little story about when this happened to me. But when I was being led by what I would say is a very authentic leader. She was leading a customer service team, and had me as a direct report in from a learning and development perspective, but actually had no real experience from an L&D point of view. So she kind of aligned our thinking just to show her own vulnerability and lack of understanding things from a training and learning development point of view, because ultimately she was accountable. But she got me on side really by explaining her lack of knowledge and skill and capability from where I was then the subject matter expert. But what that did for me, it sort of showed the ability that she was very prepared to show her vulnerability and just explain how I might be able to help and support, and how we could kind of like co-create together to be able to use her experience, but then my knowledge and capability to drive results together. So, but what I think she did particularly well was be able to communicate that openness,
Mm.
which then was very believable for me. It was very transparent, and I attached myself then to that vulnerability to be able to say, actually, I'm bought into this. So again, from a what from a coaching perspective or working with leadership, so, from a whether that's execs or senior leadership teams, the ability just to be open, communicate openly, show vulnerability and be willing to do exactly that, because like you say, that the ability to have that self-awareness and awareness of others, and how you can then create a bond. Whether
Yeah.
that really answers your question, Toby, I don't know whether, but
No,
the
it does.
storytelling bit around there for me was very much that just, it sticks in my mind very. This was many years ago, but
Mm.
it's a great example that I then use as my own point of reference. That if I don't know something, I'll be open and say it. If I don't, if somebody has a better viewpoint or map of the world than what I might have, I'm very willing to take a different perspective
Yeah.
on something. So it's that
Yeah,
perspective taking piece as well.
it is. And I think that's really important. I mean, we've all had leaders or managers, and this could be many years ago, where being vulnerable is actually something that's quite difficult. Understanding yourself first, to understand vulnerability in a way which comes across authentically, is actually a real skill. And then being able to communicate that to someone so they understand the outcome that they're trying to achieve. And I think storytelling is a really interesting one for me, because we've probably all seen people speak and they are so all consuming in terms of how they speak. You kind of lean into them. And to me, the best storytellers, presenters I've ever worked with or heard, they have a very clear style. They have a very clear link to their authentic self. So understanding how they talk, their body language, their tonality, the stories that they tell, things that are true to them, it makes them more credible. And then the best ones, they then pull threads of their experience into the storytelling element, because people remember how you made them feel. They don't
Yeah.
necessarily remember the exact words that you said. And I think that's the key thing for me. If when you understand yourself, you understand others, you take the context of the situation and you can communicate effectively, that is super powerful.
Mm.
And I suppose as we kind of close out a little bit, I suppose if you were working with someone for the first time, maybe let's say before we did a Illumina kind of snapshot with them, what would you be saying to them in terms of thinking about authenticity? This is maybe for someone who is just starting their management journey. They maybe are in a scenario or a situation where they don't feel like they can be their authentic self. I'm not a big fan of the term bring your whole self to work. I think, authenticity is the right word for me. People don't want to see the whole of you, in my opinion, maybe a little bit controversially, but how would you get people to start to think about being authentic, the first step to being authentic?
Great question. So I think there's possibly three approaches or three things to consider in my opinion, but it begins with, I think, inner work. So just thinking about your own self from a personality perspective, and that might be things like, what are my preferences? But that does go down a Lumina line. But actually, it's recognizing what the way I do wish to work, or what my values might be, or recognizing my strengths, or even acknowledging the gaps that I might have, and how do I go about filling those. So that's probably the foundation point number one for me. Second, then I think, is feedback. So be prepared to seek and gather. Be willing to open up and seek feedback around how other people's perceptions of me there are. So if I
Yeah.
was encouraging leaders just to think about themselves as being willing to seek feedback, understand other people's perspectives, and maybe even be really vulnerable about where they may recognize where I'm being triggered, or where I may behave differently to my normal day. And then the third, I think, is about practicing congruence. And what I mean by that is aligning what I say, what I do, and also how I behave, and just being conscious and intentful around that congruence. So it is intent based, but actually it's quite deliberate. But recognizing that those three things have aligned, it does link back to that sort of self-awareness, awareness of others. But yeah, what I'm saying, what I'm doing, how I'm behaving, and is that authentic?
Yeah, I mean, what a great way to finish. I think those three things really resonate in terms of take some time to reflect on who you are, your values, I think is super important, your negotiables and non-negotiables. Asking for feedback and not waiting to the end of the year to get your feedback, and be comfortable with the feedback and understand how other people will perceive you. And then that congruence at the end, putting that behavior into practice, I think are three really nice tangible takeaways that hopefully people can take from this short interview. I hope you enjoyed the first of our accelerated thinking. Big thanks to Steve, our head of training delivery, for coming along and talking about authenticity in leadership. We'll have many more of these to come, and you'll meet the rest of the team. But a big thank you to Steve, and we will speak soon. Thanks very much, Steve.
Thanks, Toby. Good conversation.